Today, the first wild boar eradication campaign of the year began at dawn. The day opened with the thin silver of morning light cutting through a low mist that clung to the fields. Neighbors arrived one by one, faces drawn and determined, carrying tools, radios, and the quiet weight of sleep still in their shoulders. There was no bravado, only the hard, shared purpose of protecting homes, livelihoods, and the crops that feed families. For months, wild boars have been tearing through fields, overturning irrigation lines, smashing corn stalks, and turning carefully tended plots into churned-up mud. What used to be orderly rows of green had become a battlefield under the animals' hooves. We gathered for a final strategy meeting beneath an old cedar. Maps were spread, shift lines discussed, safe zones and escape routes checked, and each person's role confirmed. The plan was deliberate and cautious. Teams to sweep the outer perimeter, trackers to follow fresh signs, a scout to keep watch from higher ground, and 2 medics on standby. We emphasized humane, responsible engagement. Every effort would be made to avoid unnecessary suffering, to take only decisive shots when they were unavoidable, and to respect both the law and the ethics of stewardship. Families watched from porches. Some had returned only to find their possessions trampled, their children's play areas ruined, and the sense that the land they loved had been violated. The urgency in the air was painful and resolute. As we moved into the hot zones, the forest changed its voice. Leaves whispered, birds watched in cautious silence, and the scent of damp earth rose with each step. Tracks were fresh, crescent-shaped trails, torn root mounds, and overturned nests of molehills. Wild boars are cunning and fast. And we treated each snap of a twig and broken reed as a potential sign of danger. Hounds ran ahead in controlled bursts, noses to the ground, while experienced trackers interpreted signs that would be meaningless to the untrained eye. We advanced in measured intervals, keeping lines spread to avoid cornering animals in ways that would force dangerous charges toward civilians. There were moments of eerie stillness, then sudden action. A rustle, a flash of bristled back disappearing into the underbrush, or the heavy thud of a boar crashing through a hedgerow. Adrenaline spiked, training kicked in, and calls over the radio kept everyone coordinated. When confrontation came, it was raw and immediate. At one point, a sow bolted from cover with piglets close behind. The scene became heartbreakingly chaotic as people shouted, dogs barked, and the lead hunters worked to create a safe corridor for the family to exit the field, away from roads and human structures. We do this work not out of a hunger for spectacle, but because these animals, driven by hunger and the loss of their natural habitats, increasingly cross paths with people in ways that cause real harm. Flattened crops, attacks on livestock, and escalating risks to children and the elderly. Respect for life guided our choices. Where possible, we used scare tactics and driving maneuvers to guide boars away from homes, and where lethal force was necessary, it was applied swiftly and with as little suffering as possible. In one tense exchange, a large boar charged unexpectedly. A veteran hunter with decades of experience stepped forward, his movements precise and controlled, and the animal's rampage ended in a single, humane shot. The relief that followed was tempered by sorrow. Respect for the animal, recognition of the necessity, and a shared understanding that each life taken is part of a larger. Painful balancing act. Between clashes, we cleared trampled irrigation ditches, righted overturned scarecrows, and repaired fencing to keep future incursions at bay. Young volunteers, school teachers, farmers, and even a few city neighbors who had come to help worked side by side, exchanging tips and stories, learning quickly that this is a community problem requiring a community response. We documented everything. GPS-tagged locations of dens, photographs for the local wildlife authorities, and notes on behavior patterns that might help prevent repeat incidents. Education became part of the operation, teaching people how to store feed, secure waste that attracts boars, and restore buffer areas so wildlife and farmland can coexist more safely. The medics treated minor cuts and shock. No major injuries were sustained, and that felt like a small miracle given the scale and intensity of the operation. As midday pressed on, the intensity shifted from reactive hunting to preventive measures. We set up motion-activated lights and reinforced barriers around the most vulnerable fields. Volunteers planted hedgerows and small clusters of native shrubs to act as natural buffers that, over time, will make it harder for boars to access crops without exposing themselves to predators and to the elements. There was also a careful conversation about population control measures, trap and relocate campaigns where feasible, targeted culling based on scientific guidance, and collaboration with wildlife agencies to monitor population health and disease vectors. Everyone agreed that short-term action must sit alongside long-term strategy. habitat restoration, better waste management in nearby settlements, and the revival of traditional land stewardship practices that once maintained a healthier balance between people and wild animals. By late afternoon, the land began to settle. The mettle of the day's labor showed in mud-streaked boots and sunburned necks, but also in the quiet camaraderie that forms when strangers work through crisis together. We collected what remains of damaged crops, catalogued losses for compensation processes, and spoke frankly about what needs to change. More coordinated patrols, funding for stronger fencing, and greater community training in non-lethal deterrence techniques. Before dispersing, we held a short debrief. What went well, what risks emerged, which areas still need attention, and everyone pledged to keep a watchful eye. There was gratitude, too, to the trackers who read the forest like an open book, to the medics who stayed calm, to the families who opened their homes and shared food, and to the elders whose memory of old practices helped steer modern tactics. As evening fell, we walked back through a landscape that looked unchanged on the surface, but felt different for all who had been through the day's trials. The farmhouses' silhouette softened against the dimming sky, and children once anxious began to play again in the yards, more cautiously now, but with a renewed sense of protection. The campaign was not an end, but a beginning, a necessary, sometimes painful correction, intended to restore balance and protect the vulnerable. We left with plans to reconvene, to strengthen prevention, and to work with local authorities on broader measures. In the quiet that followed, I found myself thinking about how closely human life is bound to the health of the land. How every field and fence is part of a network of responsibilities. And how, with vigilance, empathy, and well-planned action, we can reduce conflict and keep both our families and the wildlife that share this place safe. This story isn't about triumphal conquest. It's about difficult stewardship, the cost of coexistence, and the determined hands of a community who refuse to lose what they've built.